All right, now we're going to tackle our sixth and final revolution of the medieval period, troubadour love. Love is a very popular topic in society today, and I think we assume that the way we think about love is the way love actually is. What this section is designed to do is to demonstrate that our understanding of love has changed from the classical period through the medieval period and into our own period. And a lot of the ways we think about love was generated in this 11th century French context. So 3 things that I want the student to come away from this talk with is the ability to identify the central characteristics of what's called courtly love. Secondly, to describe how these characteristics were applied in medieval literature. And finally, to compare the notion of love in classical, medieval, and our own context. So I guess the best place to start is to talk about how the classical period thought about love and what were their values. The classical period, Greece and Rome saw love as a distraction from duty. They saw love as something that hinders them in what they want to accomplish in this world. They looked at manliness, they looked at virility differently than we do. Oftentimes in our society, a person is considered more manly if he sleeps with more women. In the classical period, they saw that as less manly. They saw that as unnecessarily spreading your seed, and you're not keeping that which makes you manly. Very different from how our culture sees it. One of the best illustrations of the classical notion of love is found in Virgil's Aeneid. And this is a story where Aeneas receives a divine mission to go and found a new city like Troy. Aeneas was a citizen of Troy, and Troy was under siege by the Greeks, and a goddess appears to him and says, you have to leave the city, Troy's done for. You need to go and found a new Troy, establish a new great city. So this leads Aeneas onto a journey throughout the Mediterranean, and Aeneas comes to Carthage. And in Carthage, he meets the Queen Dido and falls in love. And Queen Dido falls in love with him, and they're about to be married. But then the goddess appears to Aeneas again and says, hey, wait a minute, before you get married, I didn't send you here to fall in love. I sent you here with a divine mission to found a new state, and you're being distracted by love. So Aeneas heeds this warning and gathers his men and leaves Carthage before dawn without telling Queen Dido. And when Queen Dido realizes that her love has gone away, she commits suicide. And eventually Aeneas goes on to found Rome. Now what Virgil is trying to say in this is that for Romans, the idea of duty to the state, devotion to the state, was more important than the idea of love. Actually, in this context, love hindered Aeneas from completing his divine mission. It was a distraction from his divine mission. And we see similar notions of love in Jewish and Christian, early Christian contexts, in Celtic and Germanic contexts. So this classical idea of love was very popular in the ancient world. That's not to say that romantic love did not exist in the classical period. There was a writer named Lucretius who was very well known for promoting this idea of romantic love and erotic love. And he was somewhat of an aberration in his time, but still very influential. And actually, the French troubadour poets that we're about to discuss in the 11th century drew heavily from Lucretius and adopted a Lucretian perspective rather than the standard classical perspective on love. So let's talk about how this classical notion of love changed. In the 11th century in France, there are these poets called troubadour poets that are traveling and would would go from town to town and compose these songs and sang them for popular entertainment. There's no Netflix, there was no movie theaters, there was no Xbox. This is what people did to entertain themselves. And these poets popularized this new way of looking at love, and there was a new rules were being developed for what love is and what love should be. And the term for this is courtly love, or love of the court, between a noble man and a noble woman. Okay, not necessarily peasant to peasant, but noble to noble. Love of the court. And there are three primary characteristics of this courtly love. And the first one is humility. Subjection might be the better word for it, because it was the man who humbled himself before the woman and put her needs first, and she got to dictate the terms of love. Very similar to a vassal-lord relationship where the woman plays the role of the lord. And in this love, if the woman held a higher social station than the man, it was even more romantic because of the need for absolute subjugation and loyalty to the woman. The second characteristic is something called courtesy. The lady determined what sort of social manners she expected of the man, and expected that the man would treat her with certain manners and with a certain degree of devotion or loyalty that was absolute. So we have humility, courtesy, and the third one's a little awkward. Courtly love was, by definition, adulterous. In this time period, marriage did not have much to do with love. Marriage was engaged in order to meet family obligations, in order to procreate, to create a line of succession or inheritance, in order to improve or stabilize a family's social standing. Those were the purposes of love. It was not a freely given emotion or devotion. So when this notion of love as this free expression became popular, everyone was already in a dutiful marriage, so almost by definition it had to happen outside of that marriage. Okay. C.S. Lewis, in his Allegory of Love, says that this shift from classical to medieval, this shift that happened in the 11th century through these French troubadour poets, was so significant, it is more important to understanding our world today than the Renaissance was. And that's a huge, huge claim that he could make, and he was a person in a pretty good position to make that claim. Now, when you actually get into studying this type of love, there is one question a lot of modern scholars have. Was this type of love for real? Some of it seems way over the top, ridiculous even. Is this actually how they treated each other? And some scholars have concluded, no, this is satire, this is exaggeration. Others say, no, this is for real. And the truth might lie somewhere in the middle. In a lot of movies today, you see the ideal of the woman falling in love with the bad boy image in ways that people don't really do. You know, most women do stay away from guys who have served time in prison or what have you. But there is some truth to it. There is some real traction that idea gets in our society today. So, like most things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. What I want to do now is I want to go through some quotes from these 11th century French troubadour poets to illustrate how this love worked and how this love may be different from what came after. And two guys we'll talk about is a poet named William IX and a guy named Bernard de Ventadorn. Okay. William IX said this: "I am made better by one who is beyond dispute the best a man ever saw or heard." Notice that love is not a distraction here. Love, according to William IX, makes him better. Makes him better. Very different from the classical notion of love as a distraction. Here's a quote from Bernard de Ventadorn. "Of course, it's no wonder that I sing better than any other troubadour. My heart draws me more towards love than any other troubadour, and I am better made for love's command. Here, Ventadorn says that he is a better man because of love. It's not a distraction. It's not a hindrance. It is something that helps him. Why do I write better? Because I love better, implying that I am better because I love, and I love better. Ventadorn also said this: a man is really dead when he does not taste some sweet love in his heart. Good lady, I ask you for nothing but to take me for your servant, for I will serve you as my good lord, whatever wages come my way. Two important things about this quote. Again, he thinks it's better to be in love, that if you're not in love, you're pretty much a dead person, different from the classical notion. Secondly, he refers to the good lady also as the good lord, reinforcing this idea of a vassal-lord relationship where the woman is the lord. Again, very different from classical Germanic Celtic visions of love. A third quote from Bernard de Ventadorn: I don't wonder that love of her beauty holds me bound, because I don't think you can see a nobler body in the world. This is not platonic love. This idea of not being able to see a nobler body in the world is more erotic love. Again, more consistent with the writings of Lucretius than with most other classical authors. Now, there's another writer during this time period that wrote a manual, a handbook, a guide to love. A guy named Andreas Capellanus wrote the book Art of Courtly Love. And in this, he lists various characteristics and illustrates various characteristics that identify and mark a good lover. Someone who's truthful, modest, a good Catholic, ironically, even though this occurs in an adulterous context, clean in speech, hospitable, just, brave, generous, ready to return, good for evil, and at all times courteous. Here is a quote from Andreas Capellanus. It is agreed among all men that there is no good thing in the world, and no courtesy which is not derived from love as its fountain. Love is the fountain and origin of all good things, and without it, all usages of courtesy would be unknown to man. Love is the fountain of all good things. Love is the power of good that operates in the world. Now, keep in mind, this love only exists in a noble context, in the context of the court, between a noble man and a noble woman. This is not how peasants treated each other. This is definitely not how a peasant man treated a noble lady, or a noble lady, or a noble man treating a peasant lady. This is a very specific social context, the context of the nobility. Now, Capellanus also underlines this idea that courtly love exists in an adulterous context. Marital affection cannot be love, according to Capellanus. First, because marriage is about duty. Second, love is something that is freely given from one's heart. It is not something that is arranged by mom and dad. So almost by definition, love cannot exist in a marital context. It's interesting because this is a transitional period where love was being able to be freely expressed, but yet marriages still happened in a certain way. This idea of marrying for love would eventually come along, but not during this time period. This, again, is very different from the classical vision of what love can be. With Aeneas and Dido, love almost destroyed them. It wasn't a fountain of anything good. It didn't make them better people. It almost was disastrous in that Aeneas may have never founded Rome. And without Rome, how would we know about governments and knowledge and learning and all the great things that Rome provided for us? Love was disruptive in a classical context. It is the fountain of all good things in this 11th century French troubadour context. And there's one story I love to tell because it illustrates so many of these different aspects of courtly love. And there was a French writer named Crien de Troyes who wrote several Arthurian legends. One of them being called Knight of the Cart, which is all about Sir Lancelot. Now, in the Knight of the Cart, Lancelot is Arthur's right-hand man, best friends, best bud. Tragedy befell Camelot when Queen Guinevere was kidnapped, was taken from Arthur. Now, Arthur has duties as a king. Notice there's a duty relationship here with Arthur and Guinevere. Arthur cannot leave his throne to go find his wife, so he dispatches his right-hand man, Sir Lancelot, to recapture her for him. And during this journey, Sir Lancelot falls in love with the idea of Queen Guinevere and starts to display some of these romantic notions of love. And on his journey, he was met by a dwarf carrying a cart. And the dwarf saw Lancelot and said, "Hey, you're the one looking for the Queen Guinevere. I know where she is. If you hop in my cart, I'll take you right to her." Now, Lancelot didn't know what to make of this encounter. He didn't know if this dwarf was meaning good or ill. He didn't fully trust this guy, so he hesitated a little bit, and finally the dwarf said, "Well, if you don't want to come, that's fine. Don't worry about it." Lancelot said, "No, I'll come," and hopped in the cart. And the dwarf took Lancelot right to this body of water. And the dwarf said, "On the island in the middle here, that's where Queen Guinevere is. This is as far as I can take you." So Lancelot got out of the cart and he searched for a way to get onto this island, and he found a bridge. But when he got close to the bridge, he realized that this bridge was razor thin, and it was the only way onto the island. So he got on his hands and knees and crawled across this razor, destroying his hands and his knees, but hey, this is all worth it for the cause of love. On the other side of this bridge, Lancelot had to fight some mythical and some imaginary beasts, and he started to become weary and fatigued with this journey. And then he found one single hair from the Queen Guinevere, and this reignited his love for her and refreshed his drive and his passion to find her so he can declare his love for the queen. And eventually he finds her and professes his love to the queen. And she rejects him. And Lancelot accepts this without question and escorts her back to Arthur. During this time, Lancelot had the opportunity to ask the queen, out of curiosity, "Why did you not accept my devotion, my profession of love?" And the queen goes back to the dwarf and says, "Hey, do you remember when that dwarf offered to take you directly to me and you hesitated? True love does not hesitate." And he accepted this answer. It made sense to Lancelot. Now, this illustrates a couple of interesting things for me. Number one, this idea that love exists outside of the bonds of marriage, that Arthur and Guinevere were in a duty relationship. Lancelot and Guinevere ended up in a romantic relationship. Eventually, the queen does have a relationship with Lancelot, a romantic relationship. Secondly, it shows this vassal-lord relationship that everything for love is great. That you can, that love is worth getting on your hands and knees and crawling across a razor. Love is worth fighting mythical beings. Love is worth all of this. And it also illustrates the absolute nature of love, that the slightest hesitation is not complete loyalty and does not qualify as courtly love. In the classical period, duty, devotion to the state, that was the central organizing principle for their culture. Now, here in the 11th century, we see the introduction of a new idea that became the central organizing principle of culture, and that's love. And if you turn on the radio today, here's a challenge. Go in your car, turn on the radio, and sit there in the sun with no air conditioning until a song comes on the radio that is not at least in part about love. You will die of dehydration. This is how we organize our society. Go on Netflix, go to the movies, try and find a movie without some sort of romantic love interest. Love has become the central organizing characteristic of our society. It's become the organizing characteristic of a lot of theology. Historic Christian beliefs are now being thrown aside because it doesn't fit with the idea that God is love. Some people take the idea that God is love and use that as the central organizing principle for how we understand God's word. And we cannot accept doctrines like hell if God is a God of love. These theologies are eliminating God is just or God is holy from this equation, and they're making it solely about love. It's distorting our values to a certain extent. There's a movie, Cold Mountain, drives me crazy. And it's a great illustration of this idea of love. It's about a man who falls in love with a woman during the Civil War in the South. And when the call is given for men to enlist, this man does his duty and he enlists. Well, he gets into the army, he gets to the war front and realizes that he loves his girlfriend. He loves this woman so much that he has to leave the war in order to be together with her. And the movie portrays this as a good thing, a romantic gesture. Why wouldn't anyone who truly loves someone leave this death and violence in order to seek love? And the bad guys in the movie are these two MPs, these two sheriffs that are charged with going and tracking down deserters and bringing them to justice. And in that period of time, and actually in our period of time, that means you kill them. Deserting the army is punishable by death. And these law officers are portrayed as the bad guys. And eventually he reunites with his love, and they come along, and I believe he dies, and it's incredibly sad because breaking the law is okay if it is for love. Just about anything is justified in pursuit of love. Having served in the army, the people that desert the army, that's a problem. These are the guys that fight alongside you to the left and to our right. It is their job to make sure I can go home to my family. It's my job to make sure they can go home to their family. And if they don't have my back, then that jeopardizes all our lives. But in this one movie, this person is seen as a hero for abandoning his duty, for abandoning the guys to his left and to his right. If they end up dying and can't return home to their kids, it doesn't seem like this guy's all that concerned about because he's in love. All for the sake of love. Love has become such an organizing principle. I think it's right for us to question whether or not that is a helpful way of looking at love. I have no problem with love. I love my children. I love coaching. I love my wife. Love is a good thing. But when love becomes a central organizing principle to the expense of other ideas, I think we should rightly question it. I mean, the Bible offers us a very interesting perspective here. The Bible commands husbands, love your wives. And turns around and says, wives, obey your husbands. That's a little odd in our context because nowhere in the Bible does it command wives to love their husbands. Now, I'm glad my wife loves me, and hopefully I conduct myself in a manner that encourages that love. But there's no command for wives to love their husbands. That's interesting. I mean, that's almost unheard of in our society because it's all about love. And that's the one question I want to leave you guys with right now. Whether or not our version of love, the way we look at love in our 21st century American context, is A, what love really is, and B, is it a helpful way to look at it, and C, do the classical and medieval periods provide us some measuring stick by which we can evaluate our concept of love? Thank you.